Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So on Sunday, Pope Francis stood at St. Peter's Square for his weekly blessing, and he spoke for the first time about the children's remains found at a former residential school in Kamloops, BC, which, like most residential schools in Canada, was run by the Catholic Church.
Seguo con dolore le notizie che giungono dal Canada.
He urged Canadian political and Catholic leaders to work together to shed light on what he called a sad affair. He said he felt close to the Canadian people who've been traumatized by the shocking news, and he prayed for Indigenous families.
Nella provincia della Columbia Britannica.
But he stopped short of doing what Indigenous leaders and residential school survivors have been calling on him to do, and that's apologize. The calls for a formal apology are growing louder, and so are demands that the Catholic Church release historical records from the schools.
They could give really important insights into who the children were. Often they just received numbers and how they died, and possibly how many.
My colleague Tavia Grant is on the show today. She's been writing about the Catholic Church's response to these renewed demands for accountability. And we're going to talk about the responsibility that the Church bears in the lasting damage residential schools did to Indigenous people, what we could learn from the missing records, and why the Church still hasn't apologized. That's today on The Decibel. Hi, Tavia. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Tavia, what was the role of the Catholic Church in Canada's residential school system?
So, overall, broadly speaking, the federal government of Canada funded most of these schools and built them, and the churches ran them. It wasn't just the Catholic Church. It's important to note there were other denominations as well. But we had the majority of schools, certainly at the height of the residential school system, were run by Catholic entities. These measures, and I'm going to quote from the TRC, were part of a coherent policy to eliminate Aboriginal people as distinct peoples and to assimilate them into the Canadian mainstream against their will. So the role was basically to run these schools, and they had already started back in the 1880s. There were already Canadian churches that were operating a small number of boarding schools for Indigenous children. And it continues right up until the last one in 1996. And by design, the schools were meant to deprive Indigenous children of their language and heritage and really assimilate them into the mainstream.
And can you tell me a bit more generally about the role of Christian churches and the Catholic Church in particular in colonization?
So in Canada, at least, there were many churches did play a role. There was the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, United, Methodist, Presbyterian. They all were involved in the administration of these schools. The Catholics in particular, there's a long-standing history of a missionary zeal that involves some of the Catholic orders going overseas. We could see in our own history in Canada already in the 17th century, there was a Roman Catholic school in Quebec where missionaries hoped to, quote, civilize and, quote, Christianize young Aboriginal boys.
Right. So over the last 2 weeks, we've seen a renewed push for the church to apologize for its role in the residential school system. Survivors have been speaking out again about the abuse they faced while going to these schools in the wake of the news that the remains of children were found buried in Kamloops. But we've heard these stories many times before. We've heard calls for apologies before, most recently in 2018 when the House of Commons voted to ask the Pope to apologize.
And this is a historic day, it's a hopeful day, it's a happy day, where Canada comes to terms with its history by reaching out to Pope Francis, a man who has built a reputation around the world as a voice for justice and reconciliation, and we're calling on the Pope to walk with us on this road to reconciliation.
Until now, how has the Catholic Church actually been held accountable for the way that it ran these schools?
So there's been a lot of iterations, and this is decades in the making. I'll just take it to where we're at now. And if you ask, is there a sense that the church has been held accountable? Many survivors of these schools in Canada and their families would say no. And they would point to several factors. One is the Catholic Church hasn't yet atoned or apologized for its legacy, and that is in contrast to other leaders in the Anglican and the United Churches. There have been apologies from some Catholic orders and some local dioceses in Canada, but in terms of the Pope, he's never made a formal apology here, which is very meaningful to many of the survivors. They want to see this a heartfelt, full, and public apology. Mm-hmm. The other thing that distinguishes the Catholic Church or entities is there was a financial obligation years past to pay money towards healing and reconciliation programs. The intent was they were supposed to raise $25 million. The end result is they only raised $3.7 million. Mm-hmm. So there is a financial shortfall that people still remember, and they want to see that historic shortfall now made up for. Mm-hmm. And then the third sort of area of accountability is the fact that really not all of these historic records within Catholic entities' archives have been surfaced or have been provided to people who are trying to find out the truth, such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Right. And just before we move on to talking about the historical records, you mentioned this financial obligation that the church had to pay residential school survivors. Where did that financial obligation come from, and why have they only raised $3.7 million? Why haven't they paid that settlement?
So they were released from that obligation. So technically, they're not under that obligation anymore. It did arise out of the residential school settlement. They were certainly obliged to make their, quote, best efforts in a fundraising campaign to raise that. In terms of why, I haven't gotten to the bottom of why, other than there could have been donor fatigue. I'm not sure if best efforts were really fulfilled. And so what I'm hearing from people now is maybe it's time to revisit that.
So Kamloops is evidence of what many residential school survivors have said about children disappearing and being buried in unmarked graves. There have been stories about this for decades, and it's thought that there are many more children buried at former school sites around the country. So now Indigenous leaders, residential school survivors, and politicians too are calling for the church to release thousands of these historical records that you just mentioned from these schools. What kinds of records does the church have?
So it's hard to know all that we don't know, but here's what I can tell from talking to librarians, archivists. Certainly, there are some really key historical records that are missing, and these include the Codex Historicus. I'm learning Latin as we go, which were records of daily life. That is missing from some of the oblate files, especially the ones in French. The oblates have pledged going forward to provide these and digitize them, but the fact is they're not here now, and they were not provided in years past. So in addition to those, I've heard about correspondences and chronicles, which were kept by the nuns, photographs, some school narratives, and some photographic materials that just never surfaced.
Yeah, so what would seeing these documents help accomplish?
So again, we can only guess because they're not in the public record yet, but they could give really important insights into who the children were. Often they just received numbers, who they were and how they died, and possibly how many. We still don't know how many. We know that there's thousands more, that there's been an undercount. And it is important to get at the scale of this horror. So they would also provide probably more context. And context is also everything. It is really important to understand more about the daily living conditions. We have all this focus on the Kamloops, and yet really, really key information about what life was like there is still missing. St. Anne's in particular in Northern Ontario was known as a horrific place of abuses where children were whipped and beaten, and there was a homemade electric chair. Children received shocks. And the broad idea is that surfacing the truth and understanding and acknowledging and remembering the truth should help us to prevent this type of thing from ever happening again. It's really important that we really get to the bottom of it. And these records really ought to be provided.
And what does the church say about why these records haven't been released?
Some people do say they have all been released. So there's not widespread consensus on that. Mm-hmm. A lot of the records would have resided with religious orders, and so not in the local diocese of the church. So the religious orders operate as a separate entity. They are the ones, it's really the religious orders, as far as I can tell, that have yet to fully provide all of these documents. But the church effectively at the national level won't talk to me, so I can't really tell you what they're saying. But at the local level in Vancouver, the Archbishop did say it will be fully transparent with its archives and records regarding residential schools. And it did notably urge other Catholic and government entities to do the same. So there is a precedent. However, I did try to reach the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops many times in the past 10 days, and they have yet to respond.
Right. And I know the Truth and Reconciliation Commission went to court several times to try and get these records. What kinds of challenges did the commission come up against?
One of the members of the TRC who was in charge of gathering millions of documents, he characterized it as a lot of obfuscation. He said there were debates over semantics. There was an unwillingness to offer to provide the costs of digitization, which was very difficult for the commission itself to bear. There was a lot of debate over what was considered, quote, relevant. And the TRC really wanted to have a full picture, as much information about everything to do with these schools as possible. And yet there was still debate over what was relevant. And sometimes there was outright resistance or just a failure to provide, where they said, we're going to provide these documents, and they never showed up. So I'll sort of quote from what the spirit of the settlement was really to share information, and in some ways that never happened.
Mm-hmm. There's also a renewed push right now for the Pope to apologize for the church's role in the residential school system. So this is coming from the Kamloops First Nation. The Prime Minister has asked for it.
When I went to the Vatican a number of years ago, I directly asked His Holiness Pope Francis to move forward on apologizing, on asking for forgiveness, on restitution, on making these records available. And we're still seeing resistance from the church, possibly from the church in Canada.
Now, national Indigenous leaders are planning a visit to the Vatican to appeal for an apology from the Pope. What has been the church's response to these requests for an apology so far?
Well, in short, no apology so far, other than at the local level and in Canada and several places. But we did have on Sunday, Pope Francis did express pain over the discovery of the unmarked graves, but he did not apologize. He said, I join with Canadian bishops and the entire Catholic Church in Canada in expressing my closeness to the Canadian people traumatized by the shocking news.
The Archbishop of Toronto, Cardinal Collins, was asked about an apology from the Pope on Sunday on Rosemary Barton Live on CBC, and he said he didn't know whether seeking some big dramatic thing is the way forward.
But I think that the much more important thing is the day-to-day work, quietly, gently, and that's happening.
But this is something that survivors have been demanding, and there is a clear opportunity for the church to apologize right now. So why not just apologize?
I did try contacting the Holy See Press Office, the Vatican. I did try to get comment from Rome, and they didn't respond. I'm going to keep trying, but some people speculate that maybe litigation concerns are involved, that it might open them up to further litigation. I can only say that back in 2018, the answer for why not was, the statement was that the Pope felt that he could not personally respond, and he was giving more authority to local bishops at that time.
There's a religious and theological studies professor named Jeremy Bergen who just wrote about a possible theological reason for why the church may be reluctant to apologize. So he writes that in traditional theology, as the body of Christ, the church can't sin. So when Catholics do something good, it can be ascribed to the church, but when Catholics harm others, it is the action of individuals. What do you make of that? Is that something that you've heard people say?
The people I've been speaking with have focused on really the value of an apology, and they note that it has happened in other religious denominations. There is precedent for the Pope to make similar apologies, which suggests it is theologically possible. In one 2015 trip to Bolivia, he apologized for grave sins committed by the church against Indigenous peoples in the Americas. And then again in 2018, he issued a sweeping apology for crimes of the Catholic Church in Ireland. That was regarding abuses of children and women there. And in the same year, he apologized for errors in the way the church handled abuse cases in Chile.
Right. So there is precedent for the church to make apologies like this. So in 2019, you wrote about how the Catholic Church hasn't been held to account for sexual abuse in Canada in the same way that it has been in the US, in Australia, and in Ireland. Can you tell me why that is? And is there a common thread between that and the church's reaction to residential school survivors?
Yeah, so back in 2019, I spoke with, at that time, 9 survivors of abuse, of clergy abuse, and experts in many countries. And it was really illuminating to see where Canada stands and how we compare. I noticed at that time several things that were happening elsewhere that were really not happening here. And at the time in the US, entities were naming credibly accused perpetrators of abuse. So there were lists of priest names. And that is something that many survivors here have been wanting to see for many years. And by and large, it hasn't happened, at least in any widespread way. There are also criminal investigations in the US that really brought truth to light. And in both the US and especially Australia, both countries were able to provide a count of just how many abusers there were. And so you could get a sense of the scale of the problem. That has never really been surfaced in Canada. I tried to make some calculations in that story, but it's really hard to know just how many abusers there were and the degree to which they were shuffled from one parish to another and moved around. In terms of some common themes, what survivors told me are a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability that has surfaced throughout the years. And by transparency, I mean access to historic records, of which there are many, and by accountability, which I mean generally means saying sorry, owning up to the past, and more external oversight. I should add that it is hurting leadership here, or a lack of leadership is hurting the church itself. There was a survey back in, I think, 2018 that found that almost 8 in 10 Canadians, including half of practicing Catholics, thought that the church was doing a poor job of addressing sex abuse issues.
I know you spent some time talking to people in the Catholic community in Canada. So what's been the reaction to this refusal to apologize? What is the conversation happening among Catholics right now?
So, of course, there's variation. The people I've spoken with this week are very concerned, and they really want to see a more meaningful response. Some are frustrated, some are disappointed, and some are deeply angry at the response so far, or what they say is the lack thereof. There's been one petition that's now signed by more than 3,300 Catholics, ranging from professors to priests and nuns and lay people. And they're asking the bishops of Canada to make that request for a papal apology. And they're asking for the church to meet its previous financial obligations. Mm-hmm. I will pull a quote from one of the petitions yesterday from Concerned Catholics. It says, "We're hurt by the church we love and belong to because of its lack of action and apparent willingness to minimize and not fully assume responsibility for its and our role in one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history."
Yeah, and so do you think that this groundswell that we're seeing right now and the fact that Indigenous leaders are planning to go to the Vatican to ask for an apology, do you think any of this could make a difference? And could we see an apology from the Pope anytime soon?
I don't want to speculate, but I do think we are in a real moment. And I do think the pressure is not going to abate. And I do think that we will see some kind of meaningful response. I can't say when and I can't say what form, but I think if the church is going to survive, they're going to have to listen to their base at the very least.
Tavia, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much to Tavia Grant. You can find her on Twitter at Tavia Grant. If you like this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to say hello or let us know what you want us to cover next, you can email us at thedecibel@globemail.com. You can also tweet me at anima_TK. And if you haven't already, follow us on your favorite podcast app so you see every episode when it goes up. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.